I didn't plan to slap the Mafia boss. I didn't plan to look into the eyes of a man who ruled half the city and see something that felt like recognition, like danger, like a spark of something that had been asleep inside me for far too long. I didn't plan any of it, because I wasn't supposed to even be there that night. But life has this cruel, strange way of dragging you into the very places you swore you'd never go, and sometimes it does so with a single trembling hand, one you raise before you even realize what you've done. It started with my best friend, Lila. Sweet, fragile Lila, the kind of girl who still believed that people meant what they said, and that smiles were safe. She'd been seeing some guy from the club, an employee, one of those men who always wore black and never made eye contact unless they wanted something. He used her, humiliated her, and when she told me, her voice breaking like thin glass, I felt something inside me ignite. I told her we were going there, tonight, to make him apologize. I didn't think about who his boss was. I didn't think about what kind of world that club belonged to. I just thought about my friend, and the way her hands shook when she tried to cover her tears. The club was called Velluto, which means velvet in Italian, though the name didn't match the place at all. It wasn't soft or comforting. It was sharp, glittering, dangerous. The kind of place where people smiled with their mouths, but not their eyes, where music pulsed like a heartbeat trying to hide fear, where everything was coated in gold and sin. As soon as we walked in, I felt the eyes, men in suits, women in glittering dresses, and somewhere, in the upper section behind a curtain of smoke, the man they all looked to for permission to breathe. Damiano Moretti. I'd heard his name before, whispered like a curse or a legend. The Moretti family was old money and older blood, a dynasty built on silence and fear. I never believed half the stories, because they sounded too much like movies. Gunfights, betrayals, power built on shadows. But standing there in that club, I realized the stories were probably tame compared to the truth. We found the guy, Lila's guy, by the bar, laughing with a few others. The moment he saw her, his smirk twisted into something cruel. He called her sweetheart like it was an insult. My blood boiled. I told him to apologize, and when he didn't, I grabbed his drink and poured it over his shirt. That's when the music stopped. I didn't even notice at first. But then the crowd parted, like the sea itself had been commanded to move, and that's when I saw him. He wasn't what I expected. Not monstrous, not old, not loud, just quiet power. He stood with his hands in his pockets, wearing a dark suit that probably cost more than my rent for a year, and eyes that didn't look human in the way normal men's eyes do. They were colder, deeper, like they'd seen too much and refused to feel anymore. His hair was slicked back, but a single rebellious strand had fallen across his forehead, as if it refused to obey the rest of him. He looked almost bored, until his gaze found me. "Who's interrupting my night?" he asked, his voice low, steady, with an accent that wrapped around the words like smoke. The bartender stammered, pointing to me, and the crowd turned. Lila's hand clutched mine, trembling. I could have walked away right then. I should have. But there was something about the way everyone else froze, how every man in that room looked terrified to even breathe in his direction, that made me want to do the opposite. I've always had a problem with authority, especially the kind that thinks it owns the world. So when Damiano Moretti walked closer, his eyes dark as midnight, and asked, "Do you know whose club this is?" I looked straight into those impossible eyes and said, "I don't care." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise breaking through the stillness of his expression. "You don't care," he repeated softly, as if testing the weight of those words. "And yet you cause a scene in my house." "He humiliated my friend," I said, my voice shaking but steady enough. "If your men can't control themselves, maybe you should teach them how." The room held its breath. Someone whispered something about me being insane. Maybe I was. Maybe I am. Because in that moment, something reckless took over. The same kind of recklessness that only comes when you're standing too close to a fire and start to wonder what it would feel like to burn. And then, before my brain could stop me, before fear could sink its claws in, I slapped him. The sound cracked through the silence, sharp and shocking, echoing off marble and glass. His head turned slightly from the impact, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, my lungs forgetting how to work. Every man in that room reached for a weapon or a phone or a way to disappear. Lila whispered my name in horror, and then the impossible happened. He laughed, not loud, not cruel, just this deep, low chuckle that sent shivers down my spine. He turned back to me, his lips curving into a slow, dangerous smile, and said, "Finally, someone real." No one understood what he meant, least of all me. But the way he looked at me, like I was something rare, something untouchable, made the air feel heavy. His men stared at him, waiting for orders, but he just waved them off. "Go back to your drinks," he said, eyes never leaving mine. "The show's over." He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell him, clean, expensive, with a trace of smoke and danger. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elena," I whispered, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Elena," he repeated, as if he was memorizing it, letting it roll over his tongue like something forbidden. "You've got courage, or maybe a death wish." "Maybe "Both," I said. That made him smile again, softer this time, almost approving. "You don't belong here, Elena," he said quietly, his tone shifting darker now. "And yet here you are. I'll remember that." He turned away, just like that, and the crowd exhaled all at once, like they'd been holding their breath the entire time. I felt Lila tug on my arm, begging me to leave, and I did, though my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. As we stepped into the cold night, the air outside felt too sharp, too real, like the city itself was different now that his eyes had seen me. In the cab ride home, Lila cried the whole way, half from fear, half from relief. I stared out the window, trying to calm the storm inside my chest. I told myself it was over, that I'd never see him again, that I was lucky he didn't have me buried somewhere in the dark for what I'd done. But the truth sat heavy in my stomach, whispering something I didn't want to admit. He hadn't looked at me with anger. He'd looked at me with interest. And when a man like Damiano Moretti is interested in you, nothing in your life will ever be the same again. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my hand still tingling where it had met his face, my mind replaying his voice, his laugh, his impossible calm. I tried to convince myself I wasn't curious. I tried to convince myself I wasn't afraid. But deep down, beneath all the denial, one thought kept me awake long after midnight. A man like that doesn't let go of people who surprise him. He finds them. He keeps them. And something told me he was going to find me soon. I woke up the next morning with that strange feeling that sometimes lingers after a dream you can't quite remember, the kind that sits heavy in your chest and refuses to leave, like smoke after a fire. For a few seconds, I almost convinced myself that last night hadn't really happened, that the club, the slap, the way his eyes had held mine like a secret promise, were just fragments of some fevered imagination brought on by anger and too little sleep. But when I rolled over and saw the faint bruise on my wrist, where one of his men had tried to hold me back before Damiano told them to stand down, reality came rushing back like ice water over my skin. I didn't go to work right away. I lingered, half-dressed, sipping bitter coffee that tasted more like guilt than caffeine, staring at my reflection, and wondering how I could look exactly the same when everything inside me had shifted. There was something in the silence that morning, a kind of watchfulness, a sense that the world had tilted a few degrees, and I was the only one who noticed. The city outside my window went about its business, cars passing, people shouting, life moving forward, and yet I felt caught in some invisible current pulling me backward, back to that moment when his voice wrapped around my name and refused to let go. By the time I arrived at the bookstore, where I worked, I'd convinced myself that no one like Damiano Moretti would bother remembering a woman who slapped him. Men like him were surrounded by power and danger, by beautiful women who worshipped the ground he walked on, and I was just ordinary. Angry. Impulsive. Foolishly brave for 5 seconds, but ordinary nonetheless. So I smiled through the morning rush, shelved books, took orders for overpriced coffee, and pretended my hands weren't still trembling from the ghost of that night. It was around noon when the first sign came. A black car pulled up across the street, sleek and silent, with tinted windows that reflected the pale winter sun. I noticed it because it hadn't been there before, and because the man leaning against it wasn't the kind of person who looked lost. He wore a dark suit, crisp and unwrinkled, the kind that said business, and even though he never looked directly at me, I knew. Instinct told me before reason could catch up. He was one of them, one of his men. My heart began to race, that sickening mix of fear and something dangerously close to anticipation. When I stepped outside to throw out a stack of old boxes, the man straightened, nodded slightly, then opened the back door of the car. And there he was. Damiano. He looked different in daylight, not softer, not human, just clearer. The harsh sunlight didn't dull him. It carved him sharper, outlining the impossibly fine details of his face, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his eyes seemed darker than before, as though he carried his own night wherever he went. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just waited. I should have turned and walked back inside. I should have pretended I didn't see him. But something in his silence pulled at me like gravity, and before I could stop myself, I crossed the street and stood beside that car, feeling the weight of invisible eyes on me from every direction. "You shouldn't be here," I said quietly, though the words sounded weak even to me. "Neither should you," he replied, his voice smooth but edged with something that felt almost amused. And yet here we are. I crossed my arms, trying to hide the way my pulse was racing. "If you came to threaten me, save yourself the trouble. I already know I was stupid." He tilted his head slightly, studying me like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "You think I came here to threaten you? Didn't you?" That was when he smiled. Not a real smile, not warmth, but something colder, sharper, like a blade flashing in dim light. "If I wanted to hurt you, Elena, you wouldn't have seen me coming." The way he said my name still unnerved me, like it didn't belong to me anymore but to him, as though each syllable was a claim. He opened the car door wider, a silent invitation. "Get in. I promise you'll make it back alive." I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe defiance, maybe that pull I couldn't name. But I got in. The interior smelled of leather and smoke, the faint trace of something masculine that made my stomach twist. The car moved before I even fastened my seatbelt, gliding through the city like a shark in dark water. He didn't speak for several minutes, just watched the world outside as if it bored him. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "What do you want from me?" He turned slowly, and his gaze pinned me to the seat. "I want to understand why you did it." "Did what?" "Slap me." I almost laughed, a nervous, disbelieving sound. "You humiliated my friend. What did you expect me to do, Curtsy?" He leaned closer, his tone softening but his eyes hardening. "You could have walked away like everyone else. You could have pretended not to see. That's what people do in my world. They look away. But you didn't. You looked right at me and did the one thing no one else has dared to do in years. You reminded me that fear isn't respect." There was something raw in his voice, something that didn't belong to the man who ruled over crime and cruelty. I stared at him, unsure if I was supposed to be flattered or terrified. "You sound almost grateful." He chuckled, that same low, dangerous sound that had haunted me all night. Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm warning you. Warning me? Yes. He turned away, looking out the window. There are rules in my world, Elena. Lines you don't cross. People you don't touch. The fact that you're sitting here means you've already crossed one. And the problem with crossing lines is that there's never a way back. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. So what happens now? Are you going to make me pay for it? He looked back at me, and for the first time I saw something almost like regret flicker in his eyes. If I wanted you gone, you'd already be gone. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to tell you that you've been noticed, and that isn't always a good thing. The car slowed, pulling into a narrow alley behind my building. He nodded toward the door. Go home. Don't go out at night. Don't answer calls from numbers you don't know. And for your sake, stay away from my world. I hesitated, one hand on the door handle. You're part of that world. Are you warning me about yourself? He smiled faintly, and it wasn't comforting. Especially about me. I stepped out, heart pounding, and the door closed behind me with a finality that felt like the end of something I hadn't even begun to understand. The car disappeared down the street, black and silent, leaving behind the faint echo of his warning and the unsettling truth that part of me didn't want to be safe. That night, I sat by my window, watching the city lights flicker like dying stars, and thought about the way he'd looked at me, not like prey, but like a question he couldn't stop asking. I told myself I wouldn't see him. Again, that I didn't want to. But deep down, I already knew better. Because men like Damiano Moretti don't issue warnings for no reason. They issue them before they decide to break their own rules. And I could feel it, even from miles away, that somewhere in the dark, he was already breaking them for me. 3 days passed before I saw him again, though it would be a lie to say I didn't feel his presence before that, lingering like smoke that seeps into your clothes even after the fire's gone. His warning had echoed in my mind on repeat, that calm, almost tender voice telling me to stay away from his world, as if I still had a choice. As if the moment I met his eyes, I hadn't already crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I told myself I was fine, that life had gone back to normal, that the black car outside my window was just my imagination, that the strange calls with no one on the other end were coincidences. But the truth was, I had started to live half in fear and half in longing, and I wasn't sure which half was more dangerous. The envelope came on a Thursday morning, hand-delivered, no postage, no name, just my address written in elegant black ink, the kind that looked too deliberate to be casual. My stomach twisted even before I opened it, because part of me already knew. Inside was a cream-colored card, heavy and textured like something meant to be kept rather than thrown away. The words were embossed in gold. You are cordially invited to the Moretti Foundation Gala, Saturday, 8 p.m., Veludo Hall, and at the bottom, in that same ink-black handwriting, wear something that makes you feel powerful. DM. I read it 3 times before I realized my hands were shaking. I told myself I wouldn't go, that it was a trap, or worse, a test, one I was too smart to fail. But as the day wore on, I found myself thinking not about the danger, but about the way he'd looked at me in that car. The strange mix of warning and fascination. The way his voice had dropped when he said my name. The way my body had betrayed me by remembering the sound of it. By sunset, I was standing in front of my closet like a fool, arguing with myself while pulling out a black dress I hadn't worn in years, the one that made me feel like I could walk into a room and silence it. When I arrived, the building glowed like a cathedral built for sin, tall glass doors reflecting the city lights, chandeliers dripping gold and crystal, a string quartet playing something soft and seductive in the background. Everyone there looked perfect, men in tailored suits, women in dresses that whispered money. But beneath the glamour, there was tension, the kind that thrums beneath polite conversation, that unmistakable hum of power and fear mingling like perfume and gunpowder. And then, like gravity itself had shifted, I felt him. I didn't see him at first, but I felt the air change, that electric awareness that only comes when someone is watching, You, not idly, but with intent. When I finally found him across the room, surrounded by people who seemed to orbit him like planets, my breath caught. Damiano looked devastating in black, his suit perfectly fitted, a glass of whiskey balanced carelessly in his hand. His gaze found me instantly, as though he'd been waiting, and in that single look, the entire room faded until it was just us. He didn't move toward me right away. He let me feel it, the slow burn of his attention, the pull of it like a tide I couldn't fight. When he finally crossed the room, the crowd parted effortlessly, everyone instinctively stepping aside as if his presence demanded it. "Elena," he said when he reached me, my name sounding different in his mouth, slower, softer, deliberate. "You came." "I told myself I wouldn't," I admitted, trying to keep my voice steady. "And yet," he said, smiling faintly, "you're here." "I'm starting to think I'm losing my mind," I murmured. "Maybe you're just waking up," he replied, his tone low enough that only I could hear it. "Most people spend their lives asleep, pretending they're free while obeying invisible chains. You don't pretend." Before I could reply, he offered his arm. "Dance with me." Every instinct told me to refuse, but I didn't. The moment his hand touched the small of my back, I understood why people described danger as beautiful, because it was, terribly so. His hand was warm, commanding but not forceful, and the way he moved, confident, deliberate, made it feel like we were the only two people alive. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly, though his fingers brushed my spine in a way that betrayed the words. "Then why invite me?" His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because I wanted to see if you would." The music slowed, the air around us thick with tension. He leaned close enough that I could feel his breath against my neck. "Do you know what you've done, Elena?" "I slapped you," I said, forcing a wry tone that didn't match the way my heart was hammering. "You did more than that." His voice was like smoke now, dark and curling around every word. "You reminded me what it feels like to feel something. That's a dangerous thing to give a man like me." "And what does a man like you do with danger?" He met my eyes then, that same darkness I'd seen in the club, but deeper now, like a storm gathering. "He keeps it close, until it either saves him or destroys him." For a moment, the world stopped. The music, the crowd, the glittering lights, all of it faded beneath the weight of that stare. I didn't realize I'd stopped breathing until the song ended, and he stepped back, releasing me slowly, as though reluctant to let go. Before I could say anything, a man approached, tall, nervous, whispering something in Italian I couldn't catch. Whatever it was, it darkened Damiano's expression instantly. He nodded once, curtly, then turned to me. "I have to go." "That's it?" I asked, unable to hide the edge in my voice. "You drag me into your world, make me dance with you, and now you disappear?" He looked at me for a long moment, eyes unreadable, then said softly, "You think I dragged you in, but the truth is, you walked willingly." He left before I could answer, vanishing through a door guarded by two men with cold eyes. I stood there, dazed, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but before I could move, a waiter appeared beside me with a glass of champagne and a small black envelope on the tray. "For you, signorina," he said. Inside, in that same precise handwriting, were 5 words: "Go home. Lock your door." My blood ran cold. I looked around the ballroom, suddenly aware of how many unfamiliar faces surrounded me, how many men lingered near exits, how many eyes flicked toward me and then away. Something wasn't right. The music was still playing, but it felt like a veil now, a distraction. I didn't wait to finish the drink. I slipped through the crowd, out the doors, down the marble steps, my heels clicking too loudly on the pavement. The night air was sharp, slicing through the haze of perfume and adrenaline. I glanced behind me more than once, but no one followed. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door exactly as the note said. The silence inside was almost unbearable. I pressed my back to the door, trying to breathe, trying to convince myself that the warning was just precaution, nothing more. But deep down, I knew better. Because somewhere between that dance and that note, something had shifted. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. This was about danger, real, sharp, closing in. And as I stood there in the dark, the city humming faintly outside, my phone lit up on the counter. No number, just a single message. They know who you are. It's strange how quickly fear can become a companion, how it can slip into the cracks of your life so quietly that before you realize it, it's sitting beside you on the couch, following you into bed, whispering your name in the stillness between heartbeats. Ever since the gala, that's what it felt like fear had moved in with me, silent and patient, watching. I'd read that message. They know who you are, so many times that the words had started to lose meaning, yet their echo lived somewhere inside my chest, like a rhythm I couldn't silence. I told myself it was a threat, maybe a warning, maybe some sick trick from Damiano to keep me on edge, but deep down I knew it wasn't from him, because his kind of danger was different. His danger was deliberate, seductive, almost tender in its precision. This felt feral, chaotic, as if someone had looked through the cracks in my life and decided I was an open door. For 2 nights I barely slept. Every sound felt amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint whisper of the city outside my window. I kept checking the locks, again and again, as though the act of turning the deadbolt could keep the world from coming in. And yet, no matter how many times I secured the door, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. It happened on the 3rd night. I came home from work later than usual, the air cold and damp, the kind that smells faintly of rain and exhaust, the kind that feels like the world is holding its breath. My building was quiet, the hallway dimly lit, the buzz of a flickering bulb echoing faintly as I climbed the stairs. I remember thinking I'd take a hot shower, pour a glass of wine, try to forget the way Damiano's voice had sounded in my head every time I closed my eyes. But when I reached my door, something felt wrong. The handle was cold, too cold, and when I turned the key, I noticed the tiniest sliver of wood splintered near the lock, a detail so small I might have missed it if I wasn't already living in a state of hyper-awareness. I pushed the door open slowly, calling out my own name like it was a prayer. The apartment was dark, the kind of darkness that feels thick, almost physical, pressing against your skin. I flicked on the light, and that's when I saw it. On my kitchen counter, placed neatly in the center like a deliberate offering, was a single black rose. I froze. My body knew before my mind could catch up. Something had been here. Someone had been here. The rose wasn't from a store. It was real but unnaturally dark, petals soft and velvety, with a scent that was faintly metallic, like rain and something else, blood maybe. I didn't move for what felt like hours, my heart pounding so loudly it felt like sound. There was no note, no message, nothing but that flower staring back at me, silent and ominous, and for the first time, I felt real terror, the kind that doesn't make you scream but makes you still, the kind that roots itself in your spine. I didn't call the police. I couldn't. Because what would I say? That a man had left a flower on my counter? That I'd been warned by a crime lord and now there was a symbol of death sitting in my home? It would sound insane. And worse, I didn't trust that calling them wouldn't make it worse. So instead, I did the only thing that made sense. I called him. The phone barely rang once before he answered. Elena. My breath caught. He said my name like it was a sigh, like he'd been expecting this moment, maybe even waiting for it. Someone broke into my apartment, I said, trying to sound calm but hearing the tremor in my voice anyway. They didn't take anything, but What did they leave? That stopped me. How did you— What did they leave? His tone had shifted, sharp now, urgent. A rose, I whispered. Silence. Then a low curse in Italian, something I didn't understand but felt in my bones. I'm coming, he said. Damiano, no, don't argue with me. The line went dead. 15 minutes later, headlights flared through my window, cutting through the dark like twin blades. A knock followed, low and deliberate. When I opened the door, he was standing there. No guards this time, no entourage, just him. His hair was slightly mussed, his expression carved from stone, but his eyes burned with something fierce and cold. He walked past me without a word, scanning the apartment with the alertness of someone who lived half his life expecting an ambush. When he saw the rose, he stopped. For a long moment, he just stared at it, his jaw tightening. Then he turned to me. This wasn't a message for you, he said quietly. It was a message for me. I frowned. What does that mean? It means someone just crossed a line. He picked up the rose carefully, as if it were alive, then crushed the stem in his fist. A bead of blood welled between his fingers, dark and startling against his skin, but he didn't flinch. He looked at me instead, his eyes softer now, almost pained. You shouldn't be involved in this. I didn't ask to be, I said, anger rising through the fear. You told me to stay away, but you're the one who keeps showing up. You brought this into my life. He didn't deny it. He just looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his expression that wasn't control. It was regret. You're right, he said quietly. And I'll fix it. How? He hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small phone, black, sleek, impersonal. From now on, if anything happens, you call this number. It goes directly to me. You don't open your door for anyone but the man I send. His name is Carlo. He'll be outside from now on. Outside? Yes, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You're being watched, Elena. Not by me. By people who think they can hurt me by touching what I care about. The words hit me harder than I wanted them to. What you care about? I repeated softly, unsure if I was hearing him right. He looked away then, running a hand through his hair, as though he regretted saying it out loud. Go to sleep, he said finally. I'll take care of the rest. But I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading down the hallway, the distant hum of a car engine starting, the silence that followed after. For hours, I thought about the way he'd looked when he said those words, not like a man used to admitting weakness, but like someone who had just realized he wasn't untouchable anymore. By dawn, exhaustion finally dragged me under, but my dreams were restless, fragments of roses and fire, and his voice whispering my name like a promise and a curse all at once. When I woke, the phone he'd given me was on my nightstand. There was one new message. You should have stayed away, Elena. Now it's too late. And though I didn't recognize the number, I knew without question that it wasn't from him. There are moments in life that stretch time, moments when everything slows down, when your heart begins to measure seconds not by sound but by feeling, when you realize that the person you've been trying to stay away from has already become the air you're breathing, and that no matter how hard you try, you can't exhale them out of your system. That's what it was like after the message. It sat inside my phone like a loaded gun, quiet but deadly. And even though I tried to tell myself it meant nothing, that Damiano would take care of everything, I couldn't shake the sense that the walls around my life were closing in inch by inch. For 2 days I stayed inside, blinds drawn, my reflection barely recognizable in the dark glass. Carlo, the man Damiano had sent, stood outside my building, silent, stoic, unreadable, and though his presence was meant to comfort me, it only reminded me that I wasn't free anymore, that I was living inside the shadow of a man whose reach could protect or destroy with the same effortless precision. I tried to go about my life, but every sound made me jump, every shadow felt like a threat, and every thought, no matter how I tried to fight it, found its way back to him. Then, on the third night, there was another knock. 3 short, deliberate taps. When I opened the door, Damiano was standing there again, his expression unreadable, but his eyes holding that same relentless intensity, the kind that made you forget how to breathe. He was wearing a dark coat, the collar turned up against the rain, droplets clinging to his hair, his jaw tight with something that looked like restraint. "You need to come with me," he said, his voice lower than usual, as though the walls themselves were listening. "What happened?" I asked, already knowing from his tone that it wasn't good. He didn't answer, just stepped aside, his hand hovering near the small of my back in a gesture that was both protective and possessive, guiding me toward the waiting car. Carlo nodded once before opening the door, and I slid into the leather seat, my heart beating too fast. We drove in silence for a long time, the city melting into darkness outside the tinted windows. I kept glancing at him, at the way his jaw flexed, at the faint scar near his temple I hadn't noticed before, at the way his hands gripped the wheel like he was holding back something violent. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Damiano, tell me what's going on." He didn't look at me when he answered. "Someone tried to get into your building last night. They were seen near the back entrance. Carlo scared them off before they could get close, but they'll try again. You're not safe there anymore." A chill ran through me. "So what now? Where are you taking me?" He finally turned to look at me, his gaze unreadable. "Somewhere they won't find you." I wanted to argue, to tell him I wasn't some fragile thing to be hidden away. But the truth was I didn't want to be alone either. Not anymore. So I said nothing. The drive stretched on, winding through narrow streets, past the glittering skyline, until we reached the outskirts of the city. A place where the air felt quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that only exists where danger has learned patience. When the car stopped, I saw it. A secluded house tucked behind tall iron gates, surrounded by trees that swayed in the wind like they were whispering secrets. He led me inside, the soft hum of security systems filling the silence, and for a moment, I forgot how to feel anything but awe. The interior was minimalist, elegant, all clean lines and muted tones, the kind of place designed by someone who craved control. "This is one of my safe houses," he said, closing the door behind him. "No one knows about it, not even most of my men." "So what happens now?" I asked, though the answer was already there in his eyes. Nothing normal, nothing simple. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair, and for a fleeting second I saw it again, that flicker of weariness, the man beneath the title, the one who carried the weight of too many sins. "Now," he said softly, "you stay here. You don't leave, you don't answer calls, and you let me handle the rest." I nodded, though my heart was racing for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. The distance between us felt unbearable, the air charged with something I didn't want to name. He moved closer, not touching me but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him, the scent of smoke and rain and something darker, something that felt like danger disguised as comfort. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered. "Why do you care what happens to me?" He looked at me for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost broken. "Because you remind me of what I used to be before this world took everything that made me human. Because when you looked at me in that club, you didn't see the monster they see. You saw a man. And now I can't stop wondering what it would feel like to be that man again." There were no words that could answer that, no safe response that wouldn't ignite something between us. So I said nothing, and neither did he. We just stood there, caught in that unbearable silence, until thunder rolled outside and the storm began to beat against the windows like a warning. Hours passed. He stayed awake, sitting near the window with a gun resting on the table beside him, while I lay on the couch pretending to sleep. But I couldn't. I kept watching him, the way the dim light from the street carved shadows across his face, how his fingers brushed against his jaw every time he thought I wasn't looking, how the weight of his solitude filled the room like another presence. Around 3 a.m, there was a sound, faint but unmistakable, a crack, like something tapping the glass. He was on his feet instantly, gun raised, eyes cold and focused. My breath caught. He moved to the window, then froze, lowering the weapon slowly. "What is it?" I whispered. He turned toward me, his expression unreadable. A warning. There, stuck to the glass, was another black rose, this time crushed, its petals streaked with crimson as if dipped in blood. I stood, the world spinning slightly, and before I could reach him, lightning flashed, illuminating his face in stark relief. For the first time, I saw fear there, not for himself, but for me. He turned away, jaw clenched. "They're escalating," he muttered. "They want me distracted, desperate, and they know exactly how to do it." His hand brushed my arm, not gently, not harshly, but with that same aching awareness that lived between us, the one that both of us pretended not to feel. "You shouldn't have to see any of this," he said, voice rough. "Then stop pretending I'm not already part of it," I whispered. For a moment, he said nothing, just looked at me, his eyes burning with something that felt like anger and longing tangled into one. Then he exhaled, slow and heavy, and his hand moved to my cheek, thumb tracing the line of my jaw in a gesture so tender it made my breath falter. "You don't understand," he said softly. "Everything I touch breaks. Everything I care about becomes a weapon for someone else to use against me." "Then stop pretending you don't care," I replied. The silence that followed was unbearable. The storm raged outside, and the space between us vanished like it had never existed. When he finally kissed me, it wasn't gentle. It was desperate, fierce, the kind of kiss that feels like confession and sin all at once. It was everything we'd been trying not to say, everything that had been building in the glances and the tension and the fear. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathing hard, I saw something break behind his eyes, something raw and human and unguarded. "This can't happen again," he said, voice shaking slightly, as if he didn't believe his own words. I wanted to tell him that it already had, that once you cross a line like that, you don't get to go back. But before I could speak, his phone buzzed, cutting through the silence like a blade. He read the message and the color drained from his face. "They've taken someone," he said quietly. "Who?" He looked up at me, his expression turning to ice. "Carlo." When he said Carlo's name, something inside him shifted. Not the obvious kind of anger that burns loud and bright, but something colder, deeper, like a flame that has learned patience, the kind that smolders quietly until it consumes everything it touches. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his hand curled into a fist, at his side, in the way he seemed to withdraw into himself, as though every wall he had ever built was coming back up brick by brick. I wanted to say something, to tell him we'd find Carlo, that it wasn't his fault, that not everything that broke around him was his to fix. But the words wouldn't come. They sat heavy in my throat, because even as I tried to comfort him, a part of me knew that in his world, loss wasn't an accident. It was a message. He didn't speak for a long time, just paced the length of the room, back and forth like a caged animal trying to decide whether to attack or flee. Outside, the rain still fell, relentless and cold, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. I stood there watching him, realizing how little I truly understood about this man, this creature carved out of violence and silence, who somehow carried both damnation and salvation in the same glance. Finally, he stopped, his back to me, his voice low but steady when he spoke. they didn't take him because of you," he said, though the words sounded like they were meant more for himself than for me. "They took him because of me. Because he's loyal. Because he wouldn't talk. And now they'll use him until he breaks, and then they'll send me what's left." His tone was so calm, so matter-of-fact, that it terrified me more than if he had shouted. I stepped closer, careful not to startle him. "You can't just sit here and wait," I said softly. "You have to do something." He turned then, eyes blazing with a fury so controlled it was almost inhuman. "You think I'm not going to?" he said, voice rising for the first time. "You think I'll just let them take one of mine and walk away?" "No," I said, my own voice shaking. "I think you're angry enough to destroy everything in your path, including yourself, and I don't want to watch that happen." For a heartbeat, he looked stunned, like no one had ever dared to say those words to him before. Then something inside him cracked, not with violence but with weariness. He sank into the nearest chair, elbows resting on his knees, head bowed. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured. "Every second you're near me, you're in danger. And still, I can't make myself send you away." I hesitated, then sat down across from him, close enough to feel the tension radiating from his body like heat. "Why?" I asked quietly. "Why can't you?" He lifted his head, and the look in his eyes made my chest tighten. That strange, haunted vulnerability that only ever appeared in flashes, like lightning illuminating the wreckage beneath the surface. "Because I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who want something from me. Power, money, protection. And you're the first person who ever looked at me and didn't want anything at all. You looked at me like I was still human, even when I wasn't sure I was anymore." The words hit me with such force that I forgot to breathe. For a moment, neither of us moved, the air between us charged with something raw and electric. Something that wasn't just attraction, but understanding, recognition. Two broken pieces that fit in a way they shouldn't. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to care for something without destroying it." I leaned closer, drawn to him despite everything I should have feared. "Then don't destroy it," I said. He laughed softly, bitterly, shaking his head. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," I replied, "but you could try." He looked at me then, really looked, and whatever was left of his restraint began to crumble. His hand moved, slow and hesitant at first, then bolder, his fingers brushing against my jaw like he was memorizing me, as if he needed proof I was real. My breath caught, not from fear but from the unbearable closeness of him, the scent of rain and gunpowder and whiskey, the heat of his skin so near mine it felt like static in the air. "Tell me to stop," he said, though his voice sounded like a plea he didn't believe I'd answer. "I can't," I whispered. And then he kissed me, not gently, not carefully, but like a man who'd been starving for too long and had finally given in to hunger. The kiss was fire and confession, anger and surrender all at once, his hands tangling in my hair, mine clutching at his shirt, as if to keep the world from pulling us apart. It was everything we'd been fighting against, the tension, the fear, the need, exploding into something neither of us could control. When he finally pulled away, breathing ragged, he rested his forehead against mine. "This is madness," he murmured. "I shouldn't want you." "But you do," I said, my voice trembling. "Yes," he said, the word rough like a growl. "God help me, I do." We stayed like that for a while, tangled in silence, our breaths sinking, the world outside forgotten. Then, almost reluctantly, he stood and walked toward the window, his back to me once more. "I have to go after Carlo," he said quietly. "I can't sit here while he's out there, but if I go, they'll know I've left you unguarded, and that makes you a target." I stood too, wrapping my arms around myself, trying to fight the chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "Then take me with you." He turned sharply, his eyes flashing. "No." "Why not?" "Because if something happens to you..." He stopped, exhaling hard, struggling to find words. Because I couldn't live with that. You don't understand what I've done, Elena, what I'm capable of. I don't get to love. I don't get to have something pure, because everything I touch turns into something else, something darker. Then maybe you should stop pretending you're already too far gone, I said softly. Maybe you should let someone see you the way you really are. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he walked toward me again, his hand brushing my cheek, his eyes unreadable. If you stay, he said, voice low, you stay knowing that this can't end well. That every person who has ever loved me has paid for it, some with blood, some with their lives. I'm not afraid, I lied, and maybe he knew it, but he didn't call me on it. He leaned in, his lips barely grazing my ear as he whispered, Then you're the bravest woman I've ever met. Before I could respond, a sharp noise broke the moment. The crack of gunfire in the distance, muffled but close enough to make the windows tremble. Damiano's expression changed instantly, the softness gone, replaced by focus, by something lethal. He crossed to the table, grabbed his gun, and motioned for me to move back. Stay here, he ordered. Damiano. But before I could finish, the lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, all I could hear was the rain and the pounding of my own heart. Then, from somewhere outside, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. Damiano's hand found mine in the dark, his grip firm, steady. They found us, he whispered. And in that instant, standing there in the pitch-black room, with danger pressing in from every side, I realized that whatever this was between us, this madness, this impossible connection, it had already crossed every line it could. There was no turning back now. The first shot shattered the night like the breaking of glass inside my chest, sharp and absolute, a sound that tore through the dark with terrifying clarity, and in that instant everything changed, the fragile illusion of safety dissolving into smoke and adrenaline. Damiano's grip on my hand tightened, a silent command rather than comfort, his body moving with a precision that felt both terrifying and beautiful, controlled chaos, violence wrapped in grace. He pulled me down behind the couch just as another shot cracked through the window, showering us in shards of glass that glittered briefly before landing like frost on the floor. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might bruise my ribs, but he wasn't afraid. Or if he was, he had learned to hide it so completely that it looked like calm. Stay low, he murmured, his voice so close to my ear I could feel the heat of it, the steadiness of it, as if he were made for moments like this, as if danger was the only place he could breathe. I wanted to ask who it was, why they were here, what they wanted, but I already knew. They wanted him, and maybe, by now, they wanted me too. The house went silent after the third shot, that terrible kind of silence that vibrates with tension, the kind that tells you something is still out there, waiting. Damiano's movements were deliberate, fluid. He checked his weapon, peered through the gap in the curtain, then turned back to me. His expression had changed, hard and focused, but beneath that I caught a flicker of something else, something human, the barest trace of worry he couldn't quite hide. They're professionals, he said softly, more to himself than to me. They know how to wait. They'll want me to come out first. Then don't, I whispered, even though I knew he would. Men like him don't hide. They hunt. He looked at me for a moment, his gaze holding mine with that strange mixture of intensity and tenderness that always seemed to live in him at once. If anything happens, he began, and I shook my head before he could finish. Don't say it, I said, my voice trembling. Don't say goodbye like that. He exhaled, slow and controlled, and for the briefest second his hand came up to brush a strand of hair from my face, his touch impossibly gentle in contrast to the chaos surrounding us. You should never have met me, he whispered. Before I could answer, he was gone, moving toward the door with a silent determination that made the air itself hold still. The moment he opened it, the storm outside roared in, wind and rain and the metallic scent of danger. I heard him fire once, twice, and then the sound of movement. Footsteps on gravel, the thud of bodies, the sharp, ugly noise of violence in the dark. I wanted to look, but I couldn't. My body refused to move, frozen in that narrow strip of safety between terror and disbelief. I could hear everything, the sound of his breath, the low growl of his voice as he barked orders to no one in particular, the muffled cries of men who had made the mistake of underestimating him. Every sound was a reminder of who he was. Not the man who had kissed me, not the man who had held me like I was something precious, but the one the world feared, the one who turned fear into weapon and chaos into art. And yet, when the noise began to fade and the air filled only with rain, the silence that followed was worse. I crawled toward the window, my hands shaking, my heart in my throat. And through the shattered glass, I saw him standing there in the rain, his figure half shadowed by the flickering light from the porch. There were bodies around him, dark shapes against darker ground, and for a moment he didn't move, just stood there breathing, his gun still in his hand, his shoulders heaving with the effort of staying upright. The rain was washing away the blood on his skin, streaking down his face like tears he'd never let himself shed. I pushed the door open and ran to him before I could stop myself, the cold biting through my clothes, my bare feet splashing through puddles that gleamed red under the dim light. Damiano, I said, my voice breaking on his name, and when he turned toward me I saw it, the exhaustion, the fury, the heartbreak all tangled together in his eyes. He tried to stop me, to tell me to stay back. But I didn't listen. I reached for him, my hands trembling as I touched his arm, his shoulder, the warmth of his skin searing even through the chill. He looked down at me, his breath unsteady, his voice rough. I told you not to come out. I couldn't stay inside and pretend I didn't hear you fighting for me, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. I'm not afraid of what you are. He laughed then, a quiet, broken sound that wasn't laughter at all. You should be, he said. You don't know what I've done tonight. I looked around at the motionless figures, the rain pooling beneath them, and I felt something inside me twist. Not disgust, not even fear, but an aching kind of sorrow for the man in front of me, for the weight he carried and the things he could never escape. Then tell me, I said softly. Tell me who they were. He hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly, then sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. They were part of a rival syndicate, he said. Men who want what I have, territory, money, control. But this wasn't about business. This was personal. One of them used to work for me. He blamed me for his brother's death. Was it your fault? He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the ground, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. Maybe, but in this world fault doesn't matter, only loyalty and debts, and tonight I collected one. He dropped the gun then, letting it fall into the mud like something he was suddenly tired of carrying. The movement was small but felt enormous, a man momentarily surrendering to the weight of his own humanity. I reached for him again, my fingers brushing the side of his face, tracing the small cut near his temple where blood had mingled with rain. You can't keep doing this, I whispered. You can't keep killing pieces of yourself to stay alive. He looked at me like he wanted to believe me but couldn't afford to. You don't understand, he said. This is all I know. Every life I take, every person I lose, it becomes part of me. A blood debt that never ends. Then let me take some of it, I said impulsively, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Let me carry some of it with you. He shook his head, rain dripping from his hair, his voice low. You don't know what you're offering. Maybe not, I said. But you keep saying I don't belong in your world, and maybe that's true. But I'm already in it, Damiano. whether you want me here or not." He closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, there was something different in them. Not softness, not peace, but surrender. "You should hate me," he murmured. "You should run." "Maybe I should," I said, stepping closer until there was no space between us. "But I don't." The storm had eased into a drizzle now, the air thick with the smell of rain and smoke and iron. He reached for me, his hand trembling slightly as it settled against the back of my neck, and when he kissed me, it wasn't like before. It wasn't desperate or wild. It was quiet, aching, heavy with everything we couldn't say. Apology, promise, inevitability. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were darker than the night around us. "They'll come again," he said, stronger, smarter. Tonight was only the beginning. "Then we'll face it," I said, though my voice broke halfway through. He shook his head. "No, I will. You're leaving the city tomorrow. I'll make the arrangements." I started to protest, but he silenced me with a look that left no room for argument. "This isn't about choice anymore, Elena," he said softly. "It's about survival, and sometimes love means protecting someone from yourself." And as he turned away, disappearing into the rain, I realized that maybe that was the cruelest truth of all, that sometimes the people who save you are also the ones who destroy you, and that love, in his world, was never a sanctuary. It was a sentence. I didn't sleep that night, though I tried to pretend I did, lying there on the couch that still smelled faintly of him, of gunpowder and rain, and something darker, something that had no name but clung to my skin like smoke. The house was quiet except for the steady rhythm of the storm outside, that soft, ceaseless whisper of rain that felt almost like a voice, low and mournful, telling me things I didn't want to hear. I could still see him in my mind, the way he'd walked away from me, shoulders tense, jaw set, rain dripping from his hair, his silhouette fading into the dark like a ghost returning to the shadows where he belonged. He said I would leave in the morning, that he would make arrangements, that this was for my safety, for my own good. But the truth was that he was trying to protect himself as much as me, because every time he looked at me, I saw that flicker of weakness he didn't know how to hide, the one that made him human again, the one that terrified him. When dawn came, the sky was a muted gray, pale light filtering through the broken window, painting everything in the cold hue of aftermath. The blood was gone from the gravel outside, washed away by the night's relentless rain, but the smell of it still lingered, faint and metallic, an invisible reminder of what had happened, of what he'd done to keep me safe. I thought about leaving before he came back, about slipping out the door, disappearing, sparing both of us the inevitable. But when I reached for the door handle, my hand froze, because some part of me knew that even if I walked away, he would find me again. Not because he wanted to, but because we were already too entangled, two people bound together by something that wasn't love and wasn't hate, but something in between, something hungrier and far more dangerous. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped between leaving and staying, before the sound of the front door opening made me turn. He was there, disheveled, tired, blood on his sleeve that wasn't his, the kind of exhaustion in his eyes that spoke of more than sleeplessness. He looked at me like he wasn't sure I would still be there. And for a moment, the mask slipped, the weight of everything he carried flickering across his face before he forced it away again. "You're still here," he said quietly, almost surprised. "I thought about leaving," I admitted. "Why didn't you?" I met his gaze, my throat tightening. "Because you didn't tell me where to go." He let out a slow breath, one that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You shouldn't wait for me to decide your fate, Elena." "Maybe I'm tired of running from it," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw it happen, that tiny fracture in his composure, that moment when something inside him gave way, when the iron control that had defined him cracked just enough to let the truth through. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, and before I could move, his hands were on my face, his mouth crashing into mine with a force that felt like both an apology and a surrender. The kiss wasn't soft, wasn't tender. It was raw and desperate, and full of every word we hadn't said, every feeling we'd been trying to bury beneath fear and anger and denial. It tasted like rain and salt and inevitability, like something that was doomed from the start but too powerful to resist. His hands were rough, trembling slightly as they traced my jaw, my neck, as though he couldn't decide whether he wanted to hold me or push me away, and I felt myself break under it, felt every defense I'd built melt away until all that was left was want. Sharp, dangerous, all-consuming. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, his breath unsteady. "This is wrong," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I know," I whispered, and still, I breathed, and that was all it took. The rest was a blur, the way he lifted me, the way the world fell away until there was nothing but the heat of his skin, the sound of rain against the windows, the taste of his name on my lips. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't careful. It was everything that happens when two people who have been holding back for too long finally give in, when restraint becomes impossible, and desire turns into something close to destruction. Every touch felt like confession, every breath like the echo of a promise neither of us had made but both understood. After, we lay in silence, the air between us heavy with exhaustion, and the kind of closeness that doesn't bring comfort, but ache. He was staring at the ceiling, one arm draped across his eyes, his chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. I traced the faint scars along his shoulder, small pale reminders of a life spent in violence, of a man who had survived too many endings. "You're quiet," I said softly. He lowered his arm, turning his head to look at me. "I'm trying to remember what it felt like to be clean," he said. The words hit me like a knife. "You can't keep blaming yourself for everything," I said, though I knew it was useless. He smiled faintly, sadly. "That's all I've ever done. Every man I've killed, every friend I've buried, every woman who's looked at me the way you do, it all ends the same way, in blood. My father used to say love is the only thing that can kill a Moretti. I used to think he was wrong. Now I'm not so sure." I propped myself up on one elbow, studying him, the sharp lines of his face softened by the weak morning light. "Do you really believe that? That love can kill you?" He turned his gaze back to the ceiling. "Not love itself, what it makes you do." He stood then, pulling on his shirt, every movement deliberate, like a man bracing himself for something inevitable. "You need to get dressed," he said. "I'm sending you away today." I sat up, the blanket slipping from my shoulders. "No, I'm not leaving you." "Yes, you are." "Damiano." He turned sharply, eyes flashing with that dangerous intensity I'd seen so many times, but this time it wasn't anger, it was fear. "If you stay, they'll use you. They'll hurt you just to get to me, and I won't be able to stop it. Don't you understand? You're my weakness now. That's what they wanted, and I let it happen." I swallowed hard, my chest aching. "So what? You're just going to send me away and pretend none of this happened?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his hands gripping my arms, not hard but with enough force that I could feel the tremor in his fingers. "I'll remember every second," he said, his voice raw. "But I'd rather lose you than bury you." Tears blurred my vision, though I refused to let them fall. "And what if I don't want to be saved?" He smiled then, just barely, a ghost of a smile that broke my heart. "Then that makes two of us." The sound of his phone broke the silence, sharp and jarring. He glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened instantly. "They found the car that took Carlo," he said. "He's alive. For now." I stood, heart pounding. "Then we go together." He shook his head. "No, I'm not risking you." "You can't do this alone," I said. "I always do," he replied. and there was a finality in his tone that terrified me more than any gunfire. He kissed me once more, soft and fleeting this time, like a goodbye he couldn't bring himself to say aloud. When he pulled away, he whispered, "You'll hate me for this one day." "I already do," I said, though my voice cracked under the lie. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him like the end of something sacred, leaving me in a room that still held the echo of his heartbeat, the warmth of his touch, the scent of his skin. I wrapped myself in the blanket and stared at the empty doorway, realizing that the ache in my chest wasn't just love or fear. It was the terrible understanding that I'd already lost him, even if he was still alive. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the silence it left behind was louder than any storm. And as I sat there waiting, I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had already decided that this time he wasn't coming back. The hours after Damiano left stretched into something that didn't feel like time anymore. Just a slow, suffocating blur of waiting and silence, every minute stretching into eternity, as the weight of everything unsaid hung in the air like smoke. I told myself I'd be strong, that I wouldn't break, that he'd come back because he always did, because the thought of him not coming back wasn't something I could bear to imagine. But as the day bled into evening and the light began to fade, that fragile hope started to unravel thread by thread, leaving behind only the ache of uncertainty, the hollow kind that sits inside your ribs and won't let you breathe right. I tried to keep busy, pacing the house, checking the window, listening for footsteps that never came. The silence pressed against me until it felt like a living thing crawling across my skin. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow felt alive. I turned on the TV just to drown out the quiet, but even that didn't help. The screen's flickering light only seemed to emphasize how empty the room was without him in it. When the call came, it wasn't from him. The phone he'd given me, the one he said was for emergencies only, lit up on the counter, and my stomach dropped before I even touched it. The number was unfamiliar, but something in my gut told me to answer anyway. "Elena." The voice was low, accented, sharp around the edges, not Damiano's. "Who is this?" There was a pause, and then, "He's gone." The words hit me before I could even process them. "What?" "Damiano Moretti," the voice said flatly. "The Moretti estate was attacked an hour ago. The house is gone. He didn't make it out." I don't remember dropping the phone, but suddenly it was on the floor, the sound of the voice still faintly audible from somewhere below me as I sank to my knees, the world narrowing into a single ringing silence. Gone. The word didn't make sense. He wasn't the kind of man who could just disappear, who could be taken by something as ordinary as death. He was too much, too big, too fierce, too alive. I felt my chest tighten, my throat close, and before I could stop it, the sob broke free, raw and jagged, echoing through the empty house like something unholy. I don't know how long I stayed there, shaking, gasping, trying to convince myself this wasn't real. The voice had to be lying. Someone had to be lying. But deep down, some terrible instinct told me it was true, that the thing I'd feared most since the moment I met him had finally happened, that I'd fallen in love with a man who would leave nothing behind but ghosts and echoes, and a name whispered in fear. At some point, I forced myself to move, to stand, to do something other than drown in the ache. I grabbed my coat, my keys, the phone still buzzing with unanswered calls. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay still any longer. The night outside was cold, sharp, the air thick with the kind of quiet that comes after violence. The city looked different, emptier, the streets washed clean by rain that hadn't yet dried. When I reached the gates of the Moretti estate, I saw the smoke before anything else, black and heavy against the night sky, rising in long, twisting spirals. The house was nothing but a shell, the windows shattered, the marble steps streaked with soot. There were police cars parked along the drive, flashing red and blue lights painting the scene in colors too bright, too alive for a place that had just witnessed death. A man in a dark coat stepped forward when he saw me, his expression grim. "Miss, you can't be here." I barely heard him. I pushed past, stumbling over debris, my voice breaking. "Where is he? Where's Damiano?" "Ma'am, please, where is he?" I shouted, the sound of it tearing from somewhere deep, something animal, something desperate. He hesitated then, something flickering in his eyes. Pity, maybe. "We found bodies," he said quietly. "It's too early to confirm identities, but no one made it out." The world tilted. I don't even remember falling, but suddenly I was on my knees again, the gravel biting into my palms, the air thick with the smell of smoke and ash. My chest felt too tight, my heart too loud. I thought of his voice, of the way he'd said my name like it was something sacred, of the way he'd kissed me that morning like a man trying to memorize something he knew he was about to lose. He'd known. Somehow, he'd known. Someone helped me to my feet, guided me away from the wreckage, but I barely felt their hands on me. The city lights blurred into streaks of color, the air cold and thin. I went home, though I don't remember how. The hours afterward are fragments, me sitting on the floor by the window, staring at nothing, the rain tapping softly against the glass, the silence pressing down like weight. It wasn't until the next morning that the numbness started to fade, replaced by something sharper, uglier. Not grief, not yet. Anger. Because the more I thought about it, the more things didn't make sense. Damiano had enemies, yes, but he wasn't careless. He never was. Every detail of his life was calculated, every move deliberate. He had safe houses, exits, contingencies. He would never just wait to die. And then there was what he'd said before he left. "They'll use you. They'll hurt you just to get to me." Maybe they hadn't killed him. Maybe they'd taken him instead. The thought hit like a spark in the dark, and once it caught, it refused to go out. I couldn't sit still anymore. I gathered everything I could find, the phone he'd given me, the last few messages, the small black notebook I'd once seen him write in, and had somehow ended up in my bag. It wasn't much, but it was something. If there was even a chance he was alive, I would find him. Hours passed. I followed every thread I could, every half-remembered name, every address I'd overheard him mention. I called numbers that didn't answer, knocked on doors that didn't open. By the time night fell again, I was exhausted, shaking, running on sheer desperation. And then, when I finally sat down to catch my breath, the phone buzzed once, vibrating against the table. Unknown number. My heart stopped. I answered. "Hello?" For a moment, there was nothing but static, faint and distant, like a whisper caught between worlds. Then a voice, rough, low, barely audible. "Elena." It was his voice. Faint, fractured, but his. I froze. "Damiano? Don't..." The word broke into static. "Don't trust..." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my breath coming in shallow bursts, my heart slamming against my ribs. Don't trust who? The police? His men? Someone close to him? I didn't know, and that not knowing was worse than anything else. I called the number back again and again, but it didn't connect. The signal was gone. I stood, pacing the length of the room, my hands trembling, my mind spinning. He was alive. He had to be. And if he was, it meant someone had betrayed him. Someone close enough to know his every move. Someone who had sold him out to the people who wanted him gone. I didn't sleep that night, and when morning came, the sky outside was burning gold against the wreckage of the city, a cruel, beautiful reminder that the world kept moving, even when yours had stopped. I made a choice then, reckless, dangerous, inevitable. I would find him, no matter what it cost. As I packed a small bag and tucked the phone into my pocket, the screen flickered once more, a new message appearing. No number, no name, just 4 words that made my blood run cold. They're coming for you. And before I could even process what that meant, I heard it. The sound of footsteps outside the door, steady and deliberate, the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. The world went silent, and I knew, with absolute clarity, that everything was about to end or begin again. The sound of footsteps outside the door was so steady, so deliberate, that for a moment I thought time itself had slowed down just to make me hear it, as if the universe wanted to mark every second before everything I knew would change. My hands were trembling, the weight of the phone heavy in my pocket, its screen still glowing with that message. They're coming for you. And though I knew I should move, should run, should hide, I couldn't, because something inside me refused to believe this was the end. Not yet. Not when there were still too many things left unsaid, too many truths clawing their way to the surface. I stood there, frozen in that terrible stillness between fear and fate, when the lock turned and the door swung open. The figure that stepped inside wasn't a stranger, and yet for a second my mind refused to recognize him, because what I saw wasn't the man who had left me 2 nights ago, sharp, controlled, unshakable, but a ghost wearing his skin, battered, bloodied, his shirt torn, his face marked by exhaustion and something deeper, something raw and hollow. It was Damiano, but changed, stripped down to the bare bones of who he truly was when all the masks had fallen away. For a moment neither of us spoke, and all I could hear was the rain starting up again outside, soft and relentless, like the sky itself couldn't stand the weight of what hung between us. Then he exhaled, slow and ragged, the sound almost a confession. "I told you to leave," he said, his voice rough, broken at the edges, but still carrying that quiet authority that could bend the air around him. "I couldn't," I whispered, though the words barely made it past my lips. "They said you were dead." He gave a small, humorless laugh, one that sounded like it hurt to make. "They tried." He stepped closer, and that's when I saw the blood, dried along his temple, streaked across his collar, the dark stain on his sleeve that hadn't fully dried yet. "You're hurt," I said, moving toward him, but he shook his head. "It's not mine," he murmured, and the way he said it made something cold settle inside my chest. "What happened?" He ran a hand through his hair, the movement weary, as if the act of speaking required more strength than he had left. "Someone inside my circle betrayed me," he said. "It wasn't the rival syndicate that came for me. It was one of my own, someone I trusted, someone who wanted everything I built." "Who?" He looked up then, his eyes catching the dim light, and in that single glance I saw it. The depth of his fury, the grief beneath it, the quiet, unending fatigue of a man who had lost too much to count. "Luca," he said finally. "He was like a brother to me. I raised him, trained him, gave him everything, and he sold me out for a promise of power. They took me to him, tied, beaten, bleeding, and he told me I'd grown soft. That loving you made me weak." I felt the words hit me like stones, guilt flooding my chest. "If I hadn't—" He stepped forward sharply, his hand gripping my chin with just enough force to make me look at him. "Don't," he said, his voice low but firm. "Don't you dare blame yourself for what I chose." And just like that, the fight went out of me. The anger, the fear, the grief. It all collapsed into something else, something deeper, heavier. I wanted to ask how he'd escaped, but the look in his eyes told me not to. There were some things about his world I was never meant to understand, and maybe never should. Instead, I reached up and touched his face, my fingers brushing the rough stubble along his jaw, the scar above his eyebrow that hadn't been there before. He closed his eyes, leaning into the touch like he hadn't realized until that moment how much he needed it. "You shouldn't have come back," I whispered. "They'll come for you again." "I know," he said softly, "but I couldn't let them come for you first." He pulled me into him then, his arms wrapping around me with a desperation that felt almost like apology. almost like prayer. His heartbeat was erratic beneath my ear, strong but uneven, and for the first time I understood that all of this, the empire, the power, the reputation, meant nothing without something to anchor him, without someone to remind him he was still human. "I can't stay," he said after a long while, the words muffled against my hair. "Not here. Not in this city. There's no coming back from what happened. They'll hunt me until one of us is dead. And if you stay with me, I'm not leaving you," I said, before he could finish. His grip tightened. "If you stay, you become part of this. You'll never get out again. You'll be marked. You'll never be safe." "Neither will you," I said. He laughed again, but it was softer this time, almost tender. "That's different. I stopped believing in safety a long time ago." We stood there in silence, our breaths tangling, the rain outside turning heavier, the world narrowing down to the sound of it against the windows. For a brief, impossible moment, I imagined what it would be like to live another kind of life, one without fear, without blood, without the ghosts that haunted every corner of his name. But dreams like that don't survive in men like him. He pulled back finally, looking down at me, his expression unreadable. "I have to go," he said quietly. "There's a plane waiting at the edge of the old airfield. It'll take me somewhere far from here, somewhere they won't find me, and I need you to go with it." "What about you?" "I'll follow," he said, though I could tell from his voice that he wouldn't. I shook my head, tears burning behind my eyes. "Don't lie to me." He smiled faintly, brushing his thumb across my lips. "Then don't make me promise something I can't keep." And I knew then, in that instant, with the rain falling harder and the world holding its breath around us, that this was the last time I would see him, that this moment, this fragile sliver of peace between storms, was all we'd ever have. When he kissed me, it wasn't like before. It wasn't desperation or fire. It was slow, lingering, full of everything we hadn't said, everything we couldn't say. It tasted like goodbye. He pulled away before I could speak again, pressing something small and cold into my palm. A silver ring, heavy and unfamiliar, engraved with the Moretti crest. "If you ever hear my name again," he said softly, "you'll know it's a lie. The man you knew doesn't exist anymore." And before I could stop him, before I could tell him I didn't care about names or empires or the sins he thought defined him, he turned and walked into the rain, his figure fading until all that was left was the echo of his footsteps and the soft whisper of water against stone. I waited long after he was gone, standing there in the doorway, the ring warm in my hand, the sky above a bruised shade of silver. I didn't cry this time. I couldn't. Because somewhere deep down, I knew that in his world, survival wasn't about who lived. It was about who was remembered, and he had made sure I would never forget. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and though the world kept moving, part of me stayed in that doorway, listening to the sound of rain. I read the papers, watched the news, waited for his name to surface, but it never did. It was as if Damiano Moretti had been erased from existence, swallowed whole by the darkness he had spent his life mastering. And yet, some nights, when the city is quiet and the wind shifts just right, I swear I can still feel him, in the rustle of leaves outside my window, in the faint scent of smoke that lingers in the air, in the steady rhythm of my heartbeat that once matched his. Sometimes I imagine he's out there still, somewhere far from here, watching, waiting, alive in the way that only ghosts can be, invisible, but unforgettable. I used to think love was a promise, something you held on to when the world fell apart. Now I know it's a shadow, something that clings to you even after the light has gone, something that never truly leaves. He once told me that everything he touched broke. Maybe he was right. But what he didn't understand was that some things aren't meant to stay whole. Some things are meant to shatter, to scatter into the dark, leaving behind just enough pieces for you to remember what it felt like to be alive. And that, I think, is what love really is.
a beautiful kind of ruin.